All right, last time I talked about the Crusades, and I want to talk about a couple of effects of the Crusades that came about as a result of all these Europeans moving across the Mediterranean and interacting with the Muslim world. The first one I actually don't have on my outline here. I just want to mention that when the Europeans conquered the Holy Land and established these Crusader states along the east coast of the Mediterranean, they opened up the Eastern Mediterranean for trade in a way that had not been before, because it had been controlled by hostile Muslim states. Now it was controlled by Christians. And as a result of this, you begin to see lots of Europeans, especially Italians, begin to use sailing to open up trade with the Eastern Mediterranean. And this dramatically increased the amount of trade going through Italy. It increased the wealth and power of Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, but then also Florence and Pisa and Milan, etc. And it also allowed Europeans to conquer islands in the Pacific, or in the Mediterranean, like Crete, or Cyprus, and use those as bases, and they began to control the Mediterranean and to really be major maritime players in the Mediterranean in a way that they were not beforehand. And the Italians in particular began to develop, they began to copy Muslim ships, and they began to develop better ships also, and I'll talk about that on Monday. But for right now, this is a big piece of Europe developing more trade and sort of amped up the acceleration of the wealth and prosperity of the High Middle Ages. But there was another aspect of the Crusades that I want to talk about, and it leads to something called the 12th century Renaissance. First of all, beginning in the 1000s, as Europe becomes wealthier just through population growth and through better agricultural production, etc., the churches start finding that there's a greater demand for education. And initially, education just starts off at cathedral schools. These cathedrals would have little schools attached to the cathedral where young men could go and learn to be what they needed to become priests. But as the popularity of the cathedral schools expands, some of these cathedral schools began to break away from their cathedrals and become independent institutions of learning. And these become the new universities of Europe. And many of the big universities that we think of as the great universities of Europe were founded at this time, late 1000s, 1100s in Europe. And so you see, for instance, Cambridge and Oxford are founded in England. The Sorbonne is founded in Paris. The University of Bologna in Bologna, Italy. And these are these would become major centers of learning, and they would attract scholars who wanted to learn. And because they were centers of learning, they began to branch out from just training priests to actually what we would call academic learning, right? They began to explore mathematics and philosophy and theology and medicine. And so you began to see universities begin to expand their knowledge base. Now, at the same time, universities were coming into existence as these institutions that want to handle knowledge. There's also a fantastic explosion of European knowledge, and this comes from the Crusades. That essentially, as Europeans are pushing Muslims back out of Spain and out of Sicily, and as they come into greater contact with the Byzantine Empire, and as they conquer, as they actually invade, in later Crusades they invade Egypt, etc., they are coming into contact with Muslim libraries. In particular, there's a really good Muslim library at Toledo in central Spain. There's a good Muslim library at Palermo in Sicily. And of course, there are great Muslim, or not Muslim, but great Christian libraries in Constantinople. And the Crusaders actually, on the Fourth Crusade, they actually conquer Constantinople. I mentioned that earlier. And so Europeans suddenly become aware of these libraries full of knowledge, and they also come into greater contact with Muslim scholars, right? When they conquered Toledo, there are scholars who are still there. And so European Christians coming from these universities begin to really discover what the Muslims know. And this is a huge amount of knowledge. I mean, the Muslim libraries were big. And part of the reason for this was that when the Roman Empire had collapsed, the Western Roman Empire had collapsed, Western Europe had in some ways become cut off intellectually from the Byzantine Empire and from the Muslim empires, because In Western Europe, we had that downward spiral of cities shrinking and trade drying up and the literacy rates falling and life expectancy falling, and education had disappeared. So essentially, Europeans had lots of libraries in monasteries and et cetera that had lots of books, but over time those got neglected. In some cases, the books were still sitting there in the 1100s and 1200s. No one had read them in 500 years. In other cases, the mice had eaten them, or they had been destroyed by fire, or they had gotten rained on, or what have you. But Europe essentially sort of forgot a lot of its ancient Greek and Roman knowledge. And in particular, Aristotle is one of the big ones. I mean, Aristotle, certainly Europeans knew that Aristotle had existed. Now, Plato was really important to Augustine, and Plato had sort of been built into Christianity. But Aristotle is different than Plato, and Aristotle was not adopted by Christianity. And in fact, Europeans only knew of a couple of books by Aristotle. The rest had been lost, so they just didn't know about them. But now, in libraries in Toledo and Palermo, etc., they suddenly find that Aristotle wrote like 30-some books. And Aristotle is considered by the Muslim scholars to be like they call him the philosopher because he is considered to be the expert on everything. He wrote on biology, and he wrote on political science, and he wrote on ethics, and he wrote on astronomy, and he wrote on everything, right? He even wrote a book on comedy and humor. He wrote on everything. And the Muslims had taken his writings and they had realized the importance of Aristotle, and they had really built a whole lot of philosophical commentaries on Aristotle. And Aristotle was really sort of the foundation of Muslim knowledge, and Europeans suddenly had to wrestle with this. But this is a problem because although Plato had been sort of built into the Christian ideology or theology by Augustine and others, Aristotle was sort of outside of it. In particular, Plato had said that human beings have an eternal soul that outlives their body, so that was pretty easy to connect that to Christianity. And Plato, remember, had said that there's this other plane of knowledge with ideal forms, and that you could just simply say that's God, and God has these ideal forms, and you could connect that to Christianity. But Aristotle was different. Aristotle says there are no ideal forms, there's just the material world here. And Aristotle says that the soul actually is just the form given to the physical body, so when the physical body dies, the soul dies. Well, that's a lot harder to make work with Christianity, right? And so Aristotle is both this amazing new source of knowledge about everything, but he's also really problematic because he's a pagan and his philosophy is in many ways antithetical to Christianity. So what are they going to do with this? But it gets even worse because, in fact, the Muslim scholars who had had all this Greek and Roman knowledge for centuries had actually expanded on that knowledge. And for instance, Muslim scholars had been in contact with India for centuries, and they had brought back a system of numbers that had been invented in India, and they had adopted this number system. We call it Arabic numerals, but the numbers we use today, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0, we call them Arabic numerals, but they actually came from India. But Muslim mathematicians had used this and had taken Greek and Roman geometry, especially from Euclid, the Greek geometer Euclid, and they had connected this to the number systems coming from India, and they had invented algebra. Right? Algebra is an Arabic word, algebra, the calculation. And so they had invented algebra, and they had pushed mathematics considerably farther than Europeans had ever seen. I mean, Europeans were still using Roman numerals, and Roman numerals are virtually impossible to do arithmetic in. I mean, just write down the Roman numerals for 17 and 12 and try to multiply them, right? I mean, what's 17 by 12? You can't do it. It doesn't make any sense to try to do that arithmetic. You either have to know what 17 times 12 is or you don't. You can't figure it out the way you can with our numbers, where you could say, well, what's 7 times 1 and 7 times 2, and what's 1 times 7 and 1 times 2. So this was a major leap in mathematical calculations. And in particular, Muslim scholars had begun to use the number 0. And Europeans didn't have the concept of zero. They didn't have a number for zero. And this revolutionizes mathematics, right? But then Muslims had also made enormous advances in medicine. They had taken ancient Greek and Roman medicine, which was pretty observation-based and sort of practical, and they had expanded on it. And they had all sorts of centuries of messing around with medicines and trying to find cures for things. And so Muslim medicine was way beyond what Europeans had. And so Europeans they're faced with this horrible problem. Here's all this new knowledge, and it seems fantastic, and it seems really useful, right? And the mathematics is mind-blowing, and the medicine seems really practical, and they have all sorts of great writings on all sorts of things. But Aristotle and the Muslim commentators are not Christian. Can a Christian society that's trying to be the city of God, that's trying to just focus on what God wants, can they adopt this knowledge? Well, Europeans took different positions. Some said absolutely not, reject all of it, forget it. Some said absolutely, let's take it all, it's all great. If it doesn't match Christianity, no problem. But others are like, no, we got to make this work. And the person who really sort of made it work was Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was he was an Italian monk who spent a lot of his career in Paris. But he spent a big chunk of his career writing something called the Summa Theologica, where he sat down and he went through basically all of Aristotle. He loved Aristotle, so he went through all of Aristotle, and he said on every single thing Aristotle said, is this compatible with Christianity? If it's not, can we make it compatible with Christianity? If it is compatible, can we keep it? And so he basically comes up with this way to take all these chunks of Aristotle and build them into Christianity. And he creates this new sort of intellectual vision of Christian knowledge that's built around Aristotle more than Plato. And it incorporates all this Muslim knowledge and mathematics, etc. And it basically says, yes, it's okay to use all this stuff. But even so, even with Aquinas saying, yeah, I've figured out how to make this palatable for Christians, these ideas are often very fundamentally different. I mean, Aristotle's whole vision of life is built not around pleasing God and getting into heaven, because Aristotle didn't believe in heaven. It's much more about what makes life meaningful here on earth. How can we understand the human condition? How can we understand what it means to be alive and to be human? And most importantly, it's individualistic. And so Aristotle is really a challenge to European culture. They can try to absorb the ideas and say, yeah, this works with Christianity, but on a more fundamental level, it's asking questions that really sort of attack the Christian city of God ideal. And so this would lead gradually from the 1200s until the Renaissance in the 1400s in Italy. You would gradually hear more and more people, as they processed all this Greek and Roman knowledge and all this Muslim knowledge, and they began to process just how much it was a different outlook on life and how much it was built around a totally different attitude about what society was all about. They began to say, maybe we've been doing it wrong, right? Maybe we need to modify our worldview. Maybe we need to fundamentally rethink how we've organized society. And when those voices are kind of faint at first and they're kind of timid at first. I don't want to go too far, but I want to ask this question. But by the 1400s, you see these voices starting to say, you know what, there's a whole different way we should be doing this. And this comes to be called the Renaissance, which we'll talk about in History 112 if you take that, because it happens after 1500. But it's a radically new vision of what a society is and what human nature is and what human beings should be doing with themselves. And so that's really, as early as the 1100s, the 12th century Renaissance, you start to see Europeans wrestling with these questions that over the next 300 years would become more and bigger questions, more and more pressing questions, more and more unsettling questions, and bigger questions that would eventually lead to the Renaissance turning away from the medieval vision of what society should be like. So there was this intellectual movement that ultimately leads to the Renaissance and leads to a change away from medieval Europe. But there's also a bunch of political and social events that happen in the 1300s and 1400s that would also begin to weaken the structures of European society. So I want to turn to those next.